Welcome to MissouriNet.com. I'm Sports Director Bill Pollock, and I'm joined by Seth Merenbloom. He is the managing editor for CampusPressbox.com, and he joins me. I wanted to talk with him last week. He's written a couple of interesting articles on Mizzou football, the protests, Gary Pinkel, Pat Ivey over the last couple of weeks. And I wanted to bring him in to get his thoughts. First of all, Seth, as always, thanks for joining me. We talk a few times throughout the season, and certainly glad to have you with me.
Well, thank you. Always appreciate the invitation to come on with you.
You have been following the Mizzou protests, concerned students, 1950, the new job for former strength coach Pat Ivey. So I guess there's a lot of layers to this. So we'll just start and kind of see where this goes. Let's start with Gary Pinkel. You had presented the idea that there might be a conspiracy, if you will, that Gary Pinkel resigning in November, a day before the BYU game, and less than a week after the players threatened to boycott the game, that might have been not all that we made it out to be, or not all that we saw, at least from what we got from Pinkel. Maybe you can kind of explain it a little bit, because I like some of the things you present.
I think using the word conspiracy is probably a little bit strong, because once we say conspiracy, we're thinking tinfoil hats and the Illuminati and stuff like that. I'd probably take a step or two back from saying conspiracy and just say that I think that there was more to it than simply Gary Pinkel's health. That's certainly a legit reason. That's completely his call, obviously. But I think that there was some convenience there, and there was maybe a little bit more to it. Because anytime you start to ruffle the feathers of the Board of Curators and state legislation, and you start, talking about dollar signs and funding, you have to kind of watch yourself a little bit, even if you are, somebody like Gary Pinkel, even being a legendary coach, for the Missouri Tigers football program, so I think there was, some underlying reasons for it, perhaps, that it was in his best interest and the program's best interest if, he kind of moved along and transferred into more of that admin type of role within the athletic department, which I think is wonderful. I was a proponent of that, back in September or October, before all of this even happened. It seemed like something that would indeed make sense. I did kind of go a step further and, found a version of Coach Pinkel's contract through the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, I believe it was. And there was a provision in there for, how his compensation would be handled if he did step down for health-related reasons. It's a little ambiguous the way I think most contracts are, and I don't know how current that particular version of the contract was that I was reading through the Post-Dispatch. But there's some legal terms in there that open to interpretation if you're not a lawyer. Probably, it does appear as if there was some kind of fund that was set up in the event that Coach Pinkel stepped down for health-related reasons. He would basically be paid out of that, however much that amount was. The contract that I was reading never stipulated how much money was in that fund, and if it was indeed the exact amount of what he's going to be paid in his admin role or not.
Yeah, that is interesting. I go back to, first of all, was it Pinkel that wanted out sooner than what we wanted, or do you think this was maybe a discussion between him and higher ups?
I think it was probably ultimately his call. I mean, I think it's fair to give him that benefit of the doubt, given all that he accomplished at Mizzou. But I would also. I think it's also easy to assume that, his higher ups, whether that was Mac Rhodes and, Tim Wolf and Arbo and Lofton, the Board of Curators, it wouldn't surprise me if they had, a little bit of input, and maybe there was a little bit of a nudge for him to do one thing or another.
what I found surprising was that when Pinkel made the announcement, he had said that on that Friday before, it might have been the Friday or the Thursday before that BYU game, that his assistant came up to him and said, "Hey, word got out that you have an illness and that you're going to be battling this." And so he felt that he needed to be upfront with his players before it got out into the media. And that's what we were told. What I found interesting, though, is that it was never pressed as to who inside the athletic department leaked this story. Because when you listen to Pinkel at his press conference when he was resigning after the BYU game, and he said that he kept it very close to himself, and he had to, because he couldn't let his coaches know. He couldn't let this get out because it could have affected recruiting over the entire summer. So there were only a select few people that really knew about this. And so it was never pressed, and the media never even pressed as to, well, how did this come out? Who leaked this information? So I found that part of it a little odd. The other thing, too, is I'm surprised that Mac Rhodes didn't take some of the brunt of this, not asking that he step down or anything, but he supported Pinkel, and of course Pinkel supported the players, and this was all based on changes that needed to be made, which included Tim Wolf being fired. But then when Pinkel and Rhodes met back up with the media the following day on Monday, it was they were supporting the players who were supporting Jonathan Butler, the student who was on the hunger strike. So it seemed like the reasons for the boycott changed.
Yeah.
And so that's where I'm kind of surprised as to, well, how come Rhodes didn't come under any fire for this?
There was some ambiguity. There was ambiguity with the whole scenario, and the involvement that Coach Pinkel and I think Pat Ivey and the players and the athletic department as a whole ultimately had in the Concerned 1950 movement. And I think my real problem with the football team's involvement with the activist movement, it wasn't so much that they were participating in the movement in some way, shape, or form. I think my ultimate problem with it was Gary Pinkel, who is ultimately in charge of the football team. When he was pressed on that involvement and questioned about the involvement, he just came off to me completely unprepared to answer questions about it. And I think if he would have been more coherent in his answers, more like Pat Ivey was on Bruce Feldman's podcast. I mean, even though I don't completely agree with the reasoning that Ivey was given, Ivey was still his thoughts were very coherent. He was very composed. If Pinkel would have shown that level of composure when he was making his public statements on Kevin Keatsman's Kansas City radio show, I would have had a much different opinion about Pinkel and his leadership of the team through the movement.
Yeah, and I actually heard that interview live. I was coming back from Kansas City with my son. We were on a school visit, and heard that interview as it happened. And yeah, Pinkel almost seemed ambushed by this whole thing. That he was off guard.
And that surprises me that he would feel ambushed by being questioned about it, given the close proximity of that interview to the events. I mean, if I were Pinkel, I would think that I would be as prepared as possible for that topic and that line of questioning. And I think, based on having listened to that interview with Kevin Keatsman, that Keatsman, appeared to kind of be, twisting the knife more and more as that interview went on, out of frustration and amazement at Pinkel's, apparent inability to verbalize what was going on.
Yeah, we're talking with Seth Merenbloom. He's the managing editor for CampusPressbox.com, and he joins me. Let's talk about strength coach Pat Ivey. It looked like he was going to be retained by Barry Odom, and now, as you call it, a hiring up. If I'm using the
falling up,
yeah, falling up. That's it.
Yes.
Yeah, falling up to a new position within the University of Missouri. What's your take on Pat Ivey through this whole situation?
I think Ivy was, and this is my opinion based on what I've read and listened to about Pat Ivy's involvement. I think Pat Ivy was the strainer, if you will, like a pasta strainer or something like that, where the players' involvement and the communication was going through Ivy, and then Ivy was disseminating it to his peers within the football team and maybe the athletic department. Because listening to his his interview with Bruce Feldman, and reading another article, I think that David Morrison had written about it sometime after that Feldman podcast. There is an ambiguity as to what Ivy's motivation was, and just how far his mentoring of the football team went within the movement.
I think he certainly has a strong connection with those players. Where does this leave the university now in terms of the football program moving forward? Can they get past this?
I think they can, and I think the reason that they can is because of Barry Odom's leadership. To be fair to myself making that comment, I wasn't a big supporter of Odom having been hired to replace Gary Pinkel. I understand the reasoning for it. I was not a fan of it. I was not a supporter of it. However, what little we know about the message that Coach Odom is communicating to recruits, I think Odom is handling it beautifully. I read an article maybe a couple of weeks ago about this, and it escapes me who wrote the article and which publication that it was in, but Odom was explaining to some of the African American recruits that these reports of the KKK being on campus and some of this other stuff simply was not the case. When I read that message that Odom was communicating to the recruits, I felt much better about the direction of the football program as they move past and forward from the Concerned Student 1950 movement and their involvement.
Here's the way that I looked at the Odom hire. Pinkel kept saying, we've got the program here, we need to get it here. I just, from a football standpoint, I don't know if you do that with a guy who doesn't have the head coaching experience. That was
right.
That was my concern. But then you see some of the other hires that have taken place in the SEC, and you think, what, he's kind of on par. Now, if you go and you walk on that campus, and look, there's some issues and there's things that have to be worked out, but I think the national media has blown this way out of proportion. I don't think the university is as bad, or is maybe going through any other issues that are far worse than what you'd see on other campuses. So there's things that have to be worked out. I think from the standpoint of having Odom, who was here, who lived through it, if they were to just wipe the slate clean and bringing a complete brand new coaching staff, that nobody that had any experience here, they wouldn't be able to relate to recruits, whether they were black or white, what the campus is really about. And that may turn out to be a very big positive for Odom moving forward.
Yeah, I completely agree with your assessment on that, Bill. And I also agree that the environment at Mizzou, it isn't as toxic as it was ever portrayed, and whatever amount of toxicity, if you will, is there, it doesn't make the campus environment much different than any other college campus, or maybe just employer, or any environment where you have multiple people in comparison. I think something else that helps the national perception of the environment at Mizzou is how the board of curators chose to handle Melissa Click's situation and her actions, and her no longer being employed at Mizzou. I think something else that helps the national perception, and that maybe this is just based on the people that I tend to follow, the talking heads that I tend to follow, but shortly after the activist movement and the protests on the quadrangle, the young Republican group, invited, Ben Shapiro, to campus, and there were some problems. I think a fire alarm may have been pulled or two, but he felt comfortable speaking at the University of Missouri, even though his message is significantly at odds with the activist movement as a whole. So you look at something like that, and then you look at what happened with Ben Shapiro, a couple of days ago at Cal State Los Angeles, I believe it was, and that was a very volatile situation that he walked into. And comparing those two things, from the perspective of a national talking head, I think events like that help to put into perspective the true nature of the environment at Mizzou right now.
However, the university was exposed, whether or not you agree with the student protests, they were probably overboard, and the demands they are making, quite honestly, are ridiculous. But at least you've got the university and students perhaps moving in the right direction. And so credit the University of Missouri. They may be taking steps that other universities and colleges across this country are not taking, where they may be sweeping things under the rug. So maybe the University of Missouri was unfortunately exposed at the beginning, but now they're taking steps to maybe correct it. And for prospective students or current students to either want to drop out or to not choose Missouri because of that, I think is very, you're looking at it very with blinders on. I mean, this is an opportunity to grow, and the university taking those steps, I think, says a lot for them, big picture.
Yes, absolutely. And the leadership that is in place right now with Hank Foley, and Hank Foley, and I'll even throw Mike Middleton into this comment, even though I'm not the biggest fan of Mike Middleton. And then there's Chuck Nelson, I think his name is the third individual that comes to mind. They're standing up to Concerned Student 1950 and saying, enough is enough with demands. Like you suggested, Bill, these demands are getting out of hand now. Asking for statues and
Right.
Things such as that. But maybe even more importantly, Mike Middleton and Chuck Henson, I think is what his name is. I think I have it right now. Yeah. They have gone on record publicly as saying, hey, we have invited Concerned Student 1950 to sit down with us and have this open dialogue that they're saying that they so very much desire, but they are not reciprocating, the communication that we're offering them.
Well, we went from football to the university as a whole. I didn't know where this would go, but good stuff, though. And Seth Merenbloom, the managing editor for campuspressbox.com. Great insight. I love reading your stuff. What else do you guys have that you're working on? Big things that are coming down the pike?
Nothing necessarily huge. We are placing some added focus on the basketball side of college sports, and we have a new managing editor for the basketball side named Bob McDonald. So I'm responsible for the football side now, and Bob is responsible for the basketball side. And Bob has brought on some wonderful new basketball writers whose sole focus is basketball, which is wonderful. Given that we are now in March, it is March 1st, and March Madness is going to be quickly upon us. So Campus Pressbox will have you covered there. We're still writing about football on a weekly basis as well, because it is the off season, but there really is no off season, with the sport. And we still do our SEC 411 podcast on an every other week basis. And I believe we may also be doing the Campus Pressbox podcast in the off season as well. And there might be a little bit more basketball thrown in there with the Campus Pressbox podcast. So, kind of some downtime, but we're still very much active in the world of college sports.
Yeah, that's good. I'll have to get with Bob and talk with him about Mizzou basketball and find out how much more of a league that.
Bob is actually more of a Horizon League guy.
Is he
kind of
really?
like that kind of a mid-major
Yeah.
type of guy. He's out of Cleveland, I believe. He brought on a writer who focuses on Dayton, and from a mid-major level, we found that there's a real market for that, and people really like to read about those mid-major teams, maybe more so than I even imagined at first.
Yeah. Well, there's a niche for everything. I mean,
Yes.
people have an interest in, and now with internet websites, I mean, you can find that niche and be specialized in so many things. That's great stuff. Well, listen, we're going to link your stories to our story at MissouriNet.com so people can read what you have to say about all of this. And I'm glad we finally had a chance to catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been fun. I always like talking with you.
Yeah, and we'll do it again soon because, like you said, football's nonstop. So we get spring coming up and everything. All right, good stuff. Seth Merenbloom from CampusPressbox.com joining us here at MissouriNet.com. Thanks for watching.